Okay, so let's talk about this the structure of personality. And most of you probably are familiar with the words here of id, ego, and superego. And these are the three layers or pieces of personality for Freud. These are not physical things. You're not going to find these in the brain. These are concepts. But these are the three pieces of personality. So let's start with the id. And I always want to kind of take a moment here to talk about a book that it's a small paperback. You could probably buy it on Amazon easily. I know our library has it, or at least they have. I haven't checked recently. Obviously, you're not going to get it physically from the library right now. But the id, you know, so this book is by Bruno Bettelheim, and it's called Freud and Man's Soul. And it's really this teeny little paperback. But what it talks about is how Freud's theory, the feeling of Freud's theory, and in some ways the meaning of Freud's ideas got changed as it was translated into English. And then if you read Freud, and I never have read Freud in the original German, that Freud actually uses the German word for soul when he's talking about the id. And so when we say the baby is born all id, that in German they would be saying the baby is born all soul. And I think that that is really an important um, distinction and a really important difference in feel for what the theory is. And so for Freud, right, when we talk about the child coming up against the social world, if we read it in the original German, Freud essentially says that the child is purely soul when it's born, and that the social world then shapes that child to be something in addition to just its soul, just it's the kind of central self that it was coming into the world. And I really want you to think about that some. But nonetheless, we call it the id. We have these Latin terms, and the reason that's the case is that the medical establishment at the time, in the beginning of the 1900s, kind of took ownership of Freud in the United States and used Latin terms that they were because Latin was the word of the language of medicine. So the id is ruled by what Freud called the pleasure principle, and it goes back to what we talked about, that the child comes into the world just wanting what they want right then. No delayed gratification, no thinking about whether I should have what I want, but that they just want what they want, the pleasure principle. And the reason that you and I don't operate only on the pleasure principle is that we've come up against the social world and we've needed to delay gratification or consider other people's needs or wants. He talks a lot about the idea of libido, which we use that word libido, and it has traditionally been thought about as if he meant sexual. But really, if you read Freud's original writings, it has more to do with creative energy than sexual energy. But he does talk about the fact that the id is what he called, well, he didn't, but eros and thanatos, which is the life and death instinct. And so essentially that we come down at the id to the very basic things that rule our life. And the child, when it's born, is just it's all they have. They haven't learned anything else from the culture and society around them. And so we see this pure kind of I just want what feels good. And then as the child moves into really it's the anal stage, but as they move through that oral stage and into the anal stage, they start to develop what Freud called ego. And ego is the mediator between the id, which is all pleasure, and the superego, which we'll talk about in a moment, which is our morality, right, that develops in the phallic stage. But the ego is about delayed gratification, and it's about what Freud called the reality principle. The idea that having to deal with the reality of life, that I might want a bottle right now, but no one's available to give it to me. I might want somebody's attention right now, but they're focused on something else. And that is the reality principle. And it's the idea of finding that balance between what's pleasurable and what is not going to harm other people or not going to anger other people or just not going to impose on other people. The ego very much is the source of mental health. That we require a strong ego to defend against anxiety while allowing enjoyment. And maybe another way of thinking about that is that when we have a strong ego, we can engage in healthier, more sophisticated defense mechanisms. And this is a good moment to say the reason some defense mechanisms are healthier than others is that they require less energy, right? That closed energy system. And so if you're just denying or you're just repressing, that takes lots of energy to carry off. Whereas if you're doing something like reactive formation, something that is a little bit more sophisticated and more subtle, it doesn't take as much energy. The superego, this third piece, is our morality, it's our conscience, it's the internalization of learned restrictions. And if you remember back to the earlier slides, that is what the phallic stage is about. The phallic stage is about internalizing, not just knowing what somebody else's rules are, but in fact making them your own rules. Our feelings of guilt come from the superego, and it's the ego's job to balance that sense of guilt, so that we can sometimes have pleasure without feeling guilty, but other times deny ourselves pleasure without feeling uncomfortable in that. And if you want to know about the superego, and if you want to know about all of these things and development, fairy tales are a good way of looking at this, and the Pinocchio is perfect. So let's think about Pinocchio for a second. Most of you should be familiar, I think, with the story of Pinocchio, even if it's just through the Disney film. But Pinocchio is a marionette, right? He's a puppet who wants to become a real boy. And his story is the story of psychosexual development and the development of ego and superego. So if we start off with Pinocchio, Pinocchio gets in all kinds of trouble because he just wants pleasure. In fact, when he runs away from Geppetto, he goes eventually to Pleasure Island, where everything you want is just given to you all the time. But you may remember that he winds up getting turned into a donkey there, which is kind of this very base animal, right? Lacking human sophistication in any way. And it is only when Pinocchio learns to be moral, when he develops a conscience, right? Because he has an externalized conscience throughout most of the movie that you might recognize as Jiminy Cricket, right? Jiminy Cricket follows him around saying, don't do that, right? But later in the movie, right, later in the story, Geppetto gets swallowed by the whale when he goes off looking for Pinocchio. And Pinocchio endangers himself, sacrifices himself for the good of Geppetto. And then he becomes a real boy. And it really does, it's a Freudian story that becoming a real boy at age 5 or 6, right, or a real person at age 5 or 6, happens because we develop superego. And it's at that moment that our personality foundation is laid. And also at that moment when we can function as a whole person without other people necessarily telling us what to do. So I'll go back there, just, so that hopefully gives you a good overview of Freud's theory. Hopefully you've also read the textbook. Hopefully you've also engaged in a small group discussion, and then we'll have our live discussions to flesh this out more in the ways that might be most useful to you. Have a great day, guys.